Thank you for joining us. My name is Cameron Abbasi. I'm Executive Editor of the BMJ. If you don't know what the BMJ is, you can speak to me afterwards. If you've got a complaint about the BMJ, speak to me afterwards. Our focus is blast injury, but just a little context. A UN report in June stated that there were 10,000 children maimed or killed in armed conflict in 2017. There are more injuries and deaths in children. There are more human rights abuses and more children recruited for armed violence. So we'll touch on some of those issues, but in particular focus will be in relation to those stats. Why is there an increase in injuries? Why, or is there a different profile of injury in children in relation to blast injury? And if the rehabilitation is more complicated, why is that the case? We have an excellent panel to take us through this, and I'm delighted to say we have Professor Ibrahim Al-Janahi, who's the Chair of Medical Education at Sidra Medicine, Qatar. Welcome. We also have James Denslow. It's helpful that you're sitting in the order that my list is, who's Head of Conflict and Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy at Save the Children in the UK. And last but not least, of course, Major General Dr. Michael von Bertoli. Is that a decent pronunciation? He's the former Director General of the British Army Medical Services in the UK. So without further ado, over to our panel. We want to make this session as interactive as possible. So please be ready with your comments and your questions. And once the panel have finished, we'll be over to you for questions. So, Professor Al-Janahi, over to you.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. And I'm told that this is very informal, so I'm not going to be speaking too much, except that giving a little bit of a highlight of what children go through when they are exposed to such a devastating situations like wars. Obviously, wars are the most devastating situation that children can go through. Now, in particular, children are peculiar about their anatomy, physiology, and their stage in life. Obviously, children are growing, and they need to grow in a most decent, conducive environment, which wars are totally against, obviously. From the perspective of their anatomy and physiology, the way that the body is made of little babies, little children, they have different distribution of weight. So their heads, for example, the infant's head is a big thing as compared to adults, where the head part is smaller in relative to their body, and therefore they are prone to have head injuries more commonly in children as compared to adults. And obviously head injuries are the most devastating amongst all the other injuries that you might go through, because it hits the brain. And as we all know, in us, brain is where recovery is very difficult. Many of our other tissues, they recover. They take time, but they recover. But brain and neural tissues usually take very long, if ever, to recover. And therefore, children being more prone for head injury, just by that anatomy itself, tells you that they are more prone to more devastating injuries. The good news is that the rehabilitation, and I'm trying to kind of depict from what was introduced, that the rehabilitation in children, and we have a rehab specialist right there, pediatric rehab, Sir Dr. Mahmoud, and our colleagues there. The rehabilitation in children needs more involvement from the providers, because you need to pay attention to their growth, their development. And that itself needs a specialization. So the problem is the specialists in children rehabilitation are rare around the world, especially in conflict areas. You will have extremely difficult time to find experts who will be able to rehabilitate a child who is badly injured in any sort of conflicts. So from the physical, to start with, as I said, the anatomy and the physiology of the children are peculiar, and they are more prone for head injuries and neural injuries. Their rehabilitation needs a higher level of expertise that are not readily available across the world. Then we go into the psychological trauma that these children go through just by being around, not even being injured, just being around in a conflict zone. They go through massive psychological trauma. A lot of these kids, when they go through this, that lives with them the rest of their lives. So they become a burden on the societies instead of becoming somebody who will add value to the society. They become a burden on their societies. So the psychological part, you cannot underestimate the amount of psychological trauma that children in conflict zones go through. As I know, there are many organizations that are focusing now more and more on the psychological trauma of children who go into these conflicts. Some of them that I know personally, they've been very much involved in trying to mitigate this huge risk, especially with the Syrian conflicts and the Yemeni conflict. Now, then we go into the next level of challenges that children in conflict zones go through, and that is their education. Children who are in conflict zones, they miss the boat on education. One of the pillars of good citizens and productive human being is education. And if you are not educated, you become another burden on the society. And that burden comes from a different aspect, different angle of problems. The children who grow into this environment of no education, stress, and so on, they become, well, unfortunately, some of them become sociopaths. They become a burden on society by pitching into the risk of violence, risk of unstable societies, the risk of getting into drugs and so on. I know that I'm speaking too much. I said I'm not speaking.
No, good. Do you want to finish?
Stop there. No,
okay.
Well, I can speak the rest of the day.
You'll get a chance to come back. Yeah. James, some more background from you, I think.
Thank you very much. And thank you for WISH for inviting us to attend. I work for Save the Children. We are a humanitarian aid agency that last year reached some 49 million children. We've almost existed for 100 years, which is something to be celebrated, but at the same time almost bemoaned. We shouldn't have to exist in many respects, but the world we live in does require organizations such as our own. Our founder, 100 years ago, Eglantine Jebb, said that all wars are waged on children. And I think we've just heard some of the specifics about how that can manifest. And the question we were asked today is, is enough effort being made to specifically combat pediatric injury? And I guess the word combat is not one I'd like to use in this regard. But I think the answer is no, we're not doing enough. And part of that comes from our knowledge and awareness of child physiology, some of the issues that were raised, as well as the macro. So very, very quickly, I thought I'd run through the macro situation we face, the micro in relation to children, and some of the solutions that we're looking to be involved in. And I think the macro is the most depressing, of course. It's the statistics that we can never really forget, that today we have 357 million children living in conflict-affected areas on this planet. That's 1 in 6 children globally, 2 in 5 children in the Middle East. So that's a huge number. And I think we have to understand how conflict is evolving and changing. It's been commented on the plenary sessions earlier today that conflict is becoming more urban, more protracted, more complex in terms of the number of armed actors fighting in it. And ultimately, the most vulnerable amongst us are the ones that find themselves on the front lines. And in particular, the issue of how explosive weapons with wide area effects have particularly devastating impacts on children. It's worth remembering that in the 1950s, only 30% of the world lived in cities. That number was about 54% in 2014, but is projected to be some 66% by 2050. So the future of the world is urban, the future of conflict is urban, and again, it's how children are hurt in those conflicts. I'm not going to talk a lot about the physiology because it was very well referenced by the professor, the idea of physical uniqueness around children and, of course, mental health issues as well. We had a big debate a year ago when we set up the Pediatric Blast Injury Partnership as to whether children are just small adults and should be treated the same, when actually we prefer the term that adults are big children. And, you need to think about how they evolved to be that. And that goes back to your point about recovering from, say, limb loss and other other conflict-related injuries. We've done a lot of work over the last 2 years on mental health and psychosocial impacts of conflict in places like Syria, in Iraq, where really, some really interesting findings have been around how toxic stress is affecting brain development, and is affecting sort of lifelong health issues like high blood pressure and susceptibility to other forms of illness. I think that's a really interesting track of work that, again, we could do more on. We need more partnerships. We need more of us looking at that. So very quickly on to one of the solutions that we've been looking at. I'm going to wave it around because it's in draft form. This is the Pediatric Blast Injury Field Manual that's been put together by the Pediatric Blast Injury Partnership, which was formed December of last year, a combination of academics from Imperial College London, of operational medics from across the continuum of care, from surgeons, from nurses, from first responders, from people who work on mental health and psychosocial issues. And it's designed to be a resource for indigenous health teams, indigenous populations responding to children being wounded, and giving them, so this won't be what the final version looks like, it'll be much more robust, a guide in which to try and treat children from that point of injury all the way through till a mental health aftercare, if you will. So it's a really interesting product that we're looking to roll out in response to demands from Syrian medics. It's the tip of the iceberg. We're looking to have it translated into Arabic, having digital training resources. We're looking to work closer with the experts like our colleagues at CIDRA and others, and we do welcome any form of feedback into the partnership going forward. So I think that I'd leave that sort of starters for 10.
Thank you, James. Before I go to Michael, please be ready with your questions. If you raise your hand, we'll bring you a microphone. So we'll go to questions straight after Michael's finished. Michael, over to you.
So good afternoon again. Thank you for coming and thank you for having us. We're all shaped, all of us, you, me, by the experiences we have throughout our lives. Mine started on a battlefield in 1982 when I saw literally hundreds of soldiers dying from injuries that led to massive hemorrhage, dying in the cold, taking up to 12 hours to be evacuated overland to a hospital. And throughout the rest of my 35 years in the army, I took part in many conflicts, and I saw a slow improvement in the quality of medical care that armies around the world give to their soldiers. As a side note, 1982, the Falklands conflict was probably the only conflict in living memory where no children were harmed. Not much to celebrate, but it's probably true. In my career, I saw hospital services, I saw training of medics improve, but it was only in about 2004 that we saw the next big quantum change in care of casualties, and it came about for a number of reasons, but the most important reason was that we started collecting data in a systematic way. We started to collect data at the point of injury, through the chain of evacuation, to the hospital, and we realized that since the First World War, the same proportion of soldiers were dying from their injuries, and the cause of death in most cases was massive uncontrolled hemorrhage. And we put in place measures to control hemorrhage at the point of injury, in evacuation, and introduced resuscitation techniques to resuscitate people using fluids and more using blood products to ensure they survived. And then we introduced what's called damage control surgery to stop bleeding before you undertake definitive surgery. That was a military revolution which has now perfused almost every leading trauma centre around the world. And in a period of less than 10 years, survival rates in hospitals around the world have improved dramatically as a result of that learning. 2 years ago, the organisation I work with deployed to Mosul to provide trauma hospitals in support of the liberation of Mosul. Nearly 30% of the casualties that reached the hospitals set up around that city were children. They were children who'd received very rudimentary first aid, and they were, most importantly, the survivors, the ones that got to hospital. And do you know what? We know almost nothing about those who failed to get there. We don't know what injured them. We don't know what treatment they received. We don't know what training the medics had received who gave the treatment. We don't know what material they were provided with. We don't know if they could afford a Panadol or an aspirin. We don't know how those children were put in ambulances. We don't know who put drips into them. We don't know what went through the drips. But what we do know is that many of them died unnecessarily, and the ones that got to hospital were the lucky ones, and they suffered, many of them, life-changing injuries. And they were treated by very competent medics who often had very little training in the care of pediatric casualties. So a year ago we got together and we said, what can we do? And the first thing we said is, let us write down what we think is the current state of knowledge about the treatment of pediatric injury. And let's follow good quality practice and get people to understand this, to do it, but most importantly to record what they do, collect the data, collect information on the outcome of what has happened, and put in place the cycle of quality that improves that process. We can only do that by collecting data in a systematic way. And so what we're trying to do with this manual is get people to use it, turn it into a useful field manual that you can put in your pocket, that you can hang in your tent, that you can put on the walls of your hospital, tells you what to do, tells you then how to record what you've done, and we're going to build a database that allows us to collect that information in a systematic way. First responders, national responders, NGOs, military, it doesn't matter who you are, we want you to capture data in the same way so that we can rapidly improve the care that we give to children. That's our mission, and that's what we're going to do.
Good. Michael, thank you very much. So get ready with your questions. I've got a question there from Professor Modi, but in summary, injuries are increasing, blast injuries are a particular problem. There is something different about the rehabilitation in children because of physiology and growth. We don't know enough about what the right interventions are to make that better. Professor Modi.
Thank you very much. Nina Modi, Professor of Neonatal Medicine, Imperial College London, but also the immediate past President of the UK Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. I'm delighted to hear that you're having this session. It's a really very important one, and I agree with everything that you say, but I'd like to know your views, please, or tell me about what work is being done to include children in battlefield research. And I will draw your attention to, for example, the CRASH trial, which was very influential in dealing with it was about the use of tranexamic acid in acute hemorrhage, and it excluded children. It was an extremely influential randomized controlled trial, a very, very large one indeed, and it excluded children. Now, because of that, we do not have age-specific guidelines, for example, for the management of major acute hemorrhage in children. So my plea to you, as well as a question, is please include children in trauma research. And my question is, what is being done to achieve that aim?
Michael, that's for you first.
So thank you. Yes, the question about TXA formed a major part of our discussion last year. There are some people who say, why don't we just do it? And of course the discussion was held at Imperial College, so thank you for the support the college gave us. The answer is not enough. That's why we're here today. But the interesting thing is that what we do know has come from first world countries, first world trauma systems, like the London Pediatric Trauma Survey that's going on. And the interesting thing that comes out of those surveys in first world countries is that children are injured, major trauma in children usually happens because they fall some distance and bang their heads, they're run over by cars, and unfortunately in some circumstances they get stabbed. So penetrating injury that leads to hemorrhage is low velocity entry by a sharp implement, or it's concussive head injury, or it's fractures caused by accidents of one sort or another. So super work came out of that review, but very little of it about the control of massive hemorrhage, and almost nothing about the impact of blast and high velocity fragment wounds in children. Now, physiologically, those wounds are...
What's being done, Michael? I mean, the question is...
Mechanically, those wounds are very similar, but what we don't know is what resuscitation protocols to use, what analgesic materials should be used. So that the answer is that there's a lot of work going on to look at the impact of trauma on children, and usually the children who get to hospital in first world trauma systems. There's nothing being done systematically to look at high velocity and blast injury in children. There is a gap which we're trying to start to fill. Okay,
very good. Unless you've got something major to add, we'll go to the next question. Yeah.
I'm Satish Girimaji, a child psychiatrist from Nimhans, Bangalore, India. My question is, when children have injury or trauma, they develop a lot of psychological consequences, including post-traumatic stress disorder. Have you done anything to address this? Because that can be very disabling, distressing.
James, do you want to take that?
Well, just one point of our of data that we had from some of the research we've done in Iraq over the last 3 years is actually how, you think of sort of children who've lived through the ISIS taking of Mosul, the liberation of Mosul, and actually they've often shown greater rates of resilience and responses than children who've not gone through that experience but have been separated from their families. And that's the key feedback, I think, on the importance of having family or caregivers along with children during either moments of medical intervention or through a process of displacement. So I think we're still learning a lot more about that, and there's a lot more in terms of MHPSS programming that's being learnt through the sector. The second big finding I'd give you to the answer to that question is that mental health and psychosocial programming should not live in isolation and by itself, but should be integrated into education, within nutrition, within other health programming as well, because it really is a sort of 360 need rather than a specific scale up.
Good, thank you. I think we'll take another question, and you can answer the next one. Please keep your questions short and your answers as brief as possible. Lady with the red glasses.
Thank you. I'm Michelle Berry. I'm the Dean of Global Health at Stanford University. I don't know if any of you are involved, but we're doing a similar multilateral humanitarian care for surgeon guideline book with WHO, and Sherry Wren is leading that with Paul Wise. My question builds upon your question about research in children and some of the more chronic issues. Has anyone started to look at the chronic effects of exposure to lead from blast injuries or particulate matter? I just came back from the Climate Action Summit where we had an issue about children and climate, but that environmental ecology in this setting of armed conflicts is very different.
Okay, so a specific question about lead. Looks
sure.
like
Well, there's two quick answers, and
Yeah.
I can discuss this perhaps further afterwards. I know there has been lots of studies around the use of dense inert metal and various depleted uranium in Iraq and how that's led to malformations and various other issues. There's also some really interesting studies by Professor Brian Barber, who I think is in the University of Tennessee, on children in Gaza who have been exposed to a sort of series of environmental conditions around water quality and other public health issues. So those are the only ones I can really say at the top of my head. I'm not sure about other metals. Michael, is there anything you want to?
Good, thank you. Two more quick questions, then we'll need to wrap up. Gentleman at the front.
Thank you. My name is Kudama. I'm from Iraq. Also, I had worked in Mosul. My question is that what could be done for the child who had lost 2 years of education, got injured and improperly managed, or got amputated, and in a country that has like a very poor system of education and health, and there's no child rehabilitation specialist.
Professor Al-Jahani.
I think that's the $6 million question, isn't it? And that's why everybody's getting together really to try to intervene early, so you can first of all, if possible, to prevent that from happening. But if it did happen, then rehabilitate them as soon as possible, get them back into education system, but get them back into the system that is conducive to their development.
Quick comment, James, and final question, then wrap up from the panel.
To add two quick things. One is don't consider children going back into education a problem solved. Often we saw with Syrian refugees in Lebanon that children put straight back into schools weren't ready for it in terms of other MHPSS programming that was needed. That's one thing. The second thing to answer on Iraq specifically is I think the World Bank's interest in a more kind of large-scale, holistic recovery program for the country is really interesting, and they're focusing on this idea of social fabric. So they're looking again to not just rebuild schools and hospitals in Fallujah and Mosul, but actually look at how children have lost years of education, how they need to kind of recover childhoods, etc. So I think the World Bank are a really interesting place to look to that answer.
Thank you. Okay, final question, very quickly, please, and then 30 seconds each, no more, from the panel to wrap up. Lady in the green scarf.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lisa Thornton. I'm the Division Chief for Pediatric Rehab Medicine at CIDRA, sitting with my colleague who's the leader at the Qatar Rehab Institute of Chicago. And we encompass 50% of all pediatric rehab providers in this country, which is highly advanced, so you can imagine we're rare. But, you know, when we think about these kids and data, first of all, the pediatric brain is not well known internationally anyway. Concussion, we don't understand. Long-term brain injury recovery, we don't understand. But it seems to me that studying the adults who survived some of this trauma would assist us in understanding post-traumatic stress disorder and recovery of a lot of the injuries. And I wonder if anyone's looking at adults who grew up in war-torn areas but survived and where they are, and if that's a research area of interest.
Good, thank you very much. Okay, let's wrap up. Michael, perhaps you could go first. and take in the answer to that question.
Well, interesting question. In the year of the 100th anniversary of the armistice in 1918, there were millions and millions of children who grew up during that conflict. And, you know, as I said at the outset, we're all shaped by the experience we have when we're younger. On the pediatric thing, I would say that children are, as we all know, remarkably resilient. And many of them will recover from the traumas they're subjected to if they're given the right care. And that right care includes very strongly that social element with someone who loves them, who they can trust. So not putting children into institutions to care for them, but putting them back into the communities from which they come, hugely important in sorting this problem out. But finally, I'd say, let's not lose hope. Part of the purpose of what we're doing is not just to collect data to improve the care of children, but to bring attention to the fact that it's happening in the first place. Prevention is better than cure. We heard this morning that the world order seems to have changed. It seems to be acceptable to use what David Nabarro rather eloquently described as collective punishment. That's what we have to stop. By identifying just how many children are being injured, maybe we can start to put more and more pressure on the people who are causing those injuries.
Michael, thank you. James?
I think just very quickly to respond to that point about other things we don't know and ways of surveying and research, I think it's more than welcome. And I think, again, it comes back to the question of what's missing. And I think that kind of brings me to, I guess, in summary, what I would say is that, again, just combine those two things we do know. A, the number of children affected by conflict, 357 million. And then B, what we don't know, whether it's pediatric brain or all these other points we discussed today. And there is a huge amount we don't know. And in that space, we must all fill with our specialisms, with our research, with our operational outcomes. So I think, if anything, this is a wake-up call around this issue that hopefully we can all really barrel behind.
Thanks very much. Professor Al-Jahani, final comment from you.
Well, I think that prevention, as mentioned there, prevention is more important than cure or trying to help after fact. And at the first instant, how do we prevent this? How do we really stop people targeting children or not caring for children being involved in these sort of devastating situations? And what we can do, all of us, is to advocate for this, to push this, keep the pressure on the decision makers, keep the I would say the advocacy going on for children throughout wherever we are. We just keep pushing that children need to be protected from all these devastating situations as much as possible in your area, in your legislator, your line manager. Just keep every one of us need to be a citizen into this big house of trying to protect children from getting into these very devastating situations. Because, again, prevention is the most important thing.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. There's a lot to do. Thank you very much for being an excellent audience and for all your questions. I'd like you to just appreciate the panel with a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.